Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, this is Red Berry Wheel here, and welcome back to another Civil Air Patrol video. In today's video, I will be talking a little bit about ICUT. Now, if you do not know what ICUT is, it is the Introduction to Communications course that is how we use radios within Civil Air Patrol. So, just to let you know, you do need to complete a few prerequisites before you can actually do the requirements, and that would be completing your GES. And if you want more information on GES, link is in the iCard, okay? So, if you want to complete the additional training required before taking the in-person test and evaluation, then you go into eServices, you go into the Learning Management System and click on Access. You enroll in the introductory course or the ICUT course, and then you should be able to look through all the videos. There are instructional videos associated with it, and there's also some quizzes that you take in the course. And then after you've taken those videos and quizzes, you can proceed on to doing your in-person practical evaluation, where someone will ask you a bunch of questions. They'll ask you how you put together the radio, like how to do a message, difference between pan-pan, mayday, and security, and all of that kind of information. So those videos will help you, and I will also have this video available for you as an additional resource to just summarize everything. If you ever want to go back and review the material, you can watch this video or go on to eServices and watch that Learning Management System course. So without further ado, let's go ahead and discuss ICUT. So ICUT is, again, the standardized practices within Civil Air Patrol with using radios. And the reason why we use radios is because cell phones can be unreliable. If there are a lot of people sending text messages because of some kind of emergency or doing phone calls, then those options for communication may go down. And in order to make sure that we can still continue communications despite the loss of cell phones, the lovely cell phones, then we have radios available. And radios, we have very specific frequencies that are assigned by the U.S. Air Force that tell us which ones we can use. And they have specific names associated with them, and they don't actually release the frequencies publicly. So people just can't randomly hop onto our radio frequencies. They're specific to Civil Air Patrol. And radios can be located in a number of different locations. They could be in a house, they could be in a van, they could be in an airplane, and they could even be handheld. And the handheld versions are typically what we use when we're going out into the field. Mission Base typically has one that's in the van installed, and then there's like that external microphone that you can use and you talk into. And then airplanes, they always have to have radio comms so that they can communicate with air traffic control or talk to the people who are on the ground. So just to be clear, there is a specific sign or a specific tactical call sign associated with the teams. And so, for example, there might be specific ones for vehicles or specific ones for airplanes. And for airplanes, like, it'll be a 2-number code that's associated with the wing. So like 31, 42, 15, and then 2 additional digits that represent the specific plane. So if it's like Ohio wing, then it would be 3124 or something like that. That it would be cap flight 3124, and then that they would be able to be called that way, or they would call other people saying that call sign. So there's 2 different voice operating modes with the wonderful radio system that we are talking about. There's Simplex and Duplex. And Simplex is just using one radio frequency going back and forth between 2 radios. And then Duplex, also called like repeater communications, is where you can have 2 frequencies. You can have the radios talk to each other by using that repeater and going over longer distances. So typically with a VHF FM radio, then a very high frequency radio, then you have to do it by line of sight. So the antennas have to send the signal from one to the other, and they have to be able to see each other, essentially, in order to send that signal. And by using a repeater, it strengthens that signal and allows them to have further distance between the two and still communicate. So if you ever go to encampment, typically they'll set up some kind of repeater station for those giant brick radios, but it's with the handheld radios. You can be able to communicate longer distances by using that repeater, and then there's sometimes also those little tiny handheld ones, and those are battery operated and like AA battery operated, and you can use the little antennas they have, but they can't actually use repeaters because they're very simple radios. So when we are using radios in emergency services, 121.5 is the frequency that ELTs, or emergency locating transmitters, send their signal. And there's also a practice frequency, which I believe is 121.775. Well, it's 121.775, I think. And you use that for the practice beacons and 121.5 for the actual beacons. And if there's like a personal ELT or a plain ELT that is going off, then we can use something called an ELPer, which is like this weird like wire thing that has like a little box, and it can help you triangulate where the signal is coming from. And then there's also something in the cap planes that is called the Becker system, where like the mission observer would use that system to triangulate where the signal is coming from as well, but from in the air. So there are a few different operations that radios have, and so there's different controls on them. There's typically a volume control, which can sometimes be an on and off switch. If you're talking about the big box radios, there's typically a separate on-off switch and then a volume knob. There's also a volume knob, which adjusts how loud or how quiet it is, and there's squelch, which adjusts like the audio versus the suppression of noise, and so you can turn it up or turn it down, and if it's making that like then turn down the squelch so that you can hear the sound more clearly through it. And typically you turn it up until you just barely hear it and then turn it down just so you get that perfect squelch. And then there's also the channel selector, the microphone, and the push to talk switch / button thing. I believe it's a switch. And the channel selector, you just kind of like turn it, and then typically the screen on the radio will indicate which one you are on. And there's the microphone, which you talk into, and when you're holding the handheld radios, you hold it vertically 3 inches away from your mouth. And if you're using the external microphone for one of the box ones that it's on the cable, you'll also hold it about 3 inches from your mouth vertically. And then the push to talk button, you push it down, you hold it for a little bit, and then you talk, just so that it doesn't cut off the beginning of your message. Because sometimes people just push and start talking immediately, and it cuts off the beginning of the message, which is when you would actually say who you're talking to. So I have this diagram here, and I'm going to explain it. There's the antenna coax, the radio transceiver, the grounder, and power source. So if you want the radio to work, you are required to have a radio and an antenna at all times, whether it be a handheld, mission-based one in the plane, whatever have you. It has to have some kind of power source with that antenna. So you also, like for the mission-based one, you want to have it grounded just so that if there is some kind of electrical problem, you can experience the electrical safety procedures properly. Okay, so I'm also going to briefly mention Zulu Time. Zulu Time is like the standardized time at the prime meridian, which is in Greenwich, within the UK. And it is essentially like you add a certain number of hours or subtract a certain number of hours depending on how far away you are from the prime meridian. So if for example, I take something from the central region, then I would add 6 hours to the current time zone in order to get to Zulu time. So if it is currently 6 a.m. in Central Time, then it would be 12 o'clock Zulu. Okay? So then it does depend on where you're located. So if you're on the West Coast, then it's 8. If you're on the East Coast of the US, it's 5. And then with daylight savings time, you just take 1 hour away, you subtract 1. So instead of it being like 5 hours on the West Coast, it would be 4, or on the West Coast, it would be 7 hours instead of 8. So whether you're on daylight savings time or off will determine what time Zulu time you're on. Okay, So there are a few different pieces of verbiage that are associated with using a radio, and I'm just going to list them off here. This is Roger, over, out, wait, say again, correction, Wilco, and affirmative. So when you're saying this is, it's associated with when you were saying your call sign. So if I was calling someone else and I am mission base, so let's say I'll just say my call sign is mission base, and then there's team alpha. So I'll say team alpha, this is mission base, over. And that would be the initiating call, because you want to make sure that the person on the other end is listening. So you'll just say person that you are trying to talk to, who you are, over. And when you say over, that means you're just kind of done talking, but you're expecting a response. So then if they hear me, then they'll say mission base, this is team alpha, go ahead, over. And then I'll say what I need, or if I'll ask them for something, then they can go ahead and give me that information. If I were to say out, that means I am done talking to them. And typically, it's good practice that if you initiate the conversation, you are the one who says out at the end, which ends the conversation. And it's a little bit rude if you're the other person who did not initiate the conversation and is like, I'm done talking, I'm out. And don't use over now, because that's just wrong. And Roger, Wilco is very redundant, because Roger is like, okay, I understand. I got what you said correctly. And Wilco is saying, Roger, I understand what you're saying, and I will comply. So if you're saying Roger, Wilco, it's like, Roger, I got it. So just use Roger when you say, okay, I understand. And Wilco is when you actually have to do something about it. Say again, if you didn't hear something, or if you just were copying down notes and you didn't get it, it's okay to say again, because that will allow you for transparent communications with whomever you are working with. Moving on, there's something called the phonetic alphabet, which goes from A to Z, and there's like a certain word associated with each letter. So there's Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot, Golf, Hotel, India, Juliet, Kilo, Lima, Mike, November, Oscar, Papa, Quebec, Romeo, Sierra, Tango, Uniform, Victor, Whiskey, X-Ray, Yankee, Zulu. And whenever you are saying something with letters, then you use those. Like I know with most call signs, like I know they say cap flight like 3124, but if you were a different aircraft, you might be like Papa Echo 625 or something like that, because you would use the phonetic alphabet to make sure that people distinguish between each of the letters, and they're very unique, each of them. And there's also a specific pronunciation with numbers. So if you think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. Those are the pronunciations for numbers, or at least you're supposed to say them that way so that each number is distinctly different. Like Niner sounds more individualistic rather than 9, because it might sound like 5 or something. Or just like with how it garbled, it might be on the radio. So that's just something to keep in mind. So there's something called the free net, and there's something called the directed net. And the free net is essentially being able to freely communicate across the net, and then directed is where you need to get permission in order to go onto the net and to speak. You need to tell them when you're getting on, when you're getting off, all of that kind of information. So there is something called the NCS, or the Net Control Station, which is basically the coordinator and keeps track of everyone and kind of like make sure that everyone understands what's going on while guiding the conversation. And then if you have to indicate some kind of distress or emergency, there's 3 different signals. There's Pan, Mayday, and Securite. Securite is the easiest one. It has to do with security/safety. So if there's something unsafe, like if there's a thunderstorm coming, then you might make some kind of Securite call. Or if there's like a giant bear that could potentially attack you, I don't know if that would be considered Securite, but I think more like the weather associated things would be Securite. And then Mayday is when there is distress, and Pan is urgency. So if, like, for example, if you use Pan, there is some kind of like emergent, like immediate need for assistance and support. So like if someone had a heart attack while they're out in the field, then that is something that would need assistance immediately, and you might need a medevac to get them, right? And then with the Mayday, there is distress. So if someone is lost, or like a team is lost out there, then they can indicate that distress of like, we have no idea where we are, we need help, or we need assistance. That typically doesn't happen because of cell phones nowadays, and people have like their own little personal GPS devices sometimes. But like if something happened where the team needed help, and it was not immediate help, but they're like, something is wrong, then using that can be included. And any kind of emergency takes priority over everything else. So if you hear Pan, you don't say anything until they are taking care of their business. If someone says Mayday, you don't just kind of like chime in and say, oh yeah, I'm just checking in, guys, hello. So just make sure you're actively listening to the radio so that you don't just like interrupt someone who's in the middle of an emergent call. Okay, and then that brings me kind of into additional bad practices that you should tend to avoid. So there isn't really supposed to be use of nicknames. There's no profanities allowed. You're not allowed to leave the net without getting permission for it first. And you're not supposed to be transmitting unless you have permission to talk on the net. You shouldn't really be interrupting other people and while they're talking on the radio. We are supposed to keep messages short and concise when we are using them, but we don't want to like interrupt someone else when they're in the middle of talking, because that is honestly pretty rude. And then if someone is doing excessive testing of the radios and they're like, radio check, radio check, radio check, radio check, then no, that is too much. Everyone is using the same frequency in order to communicate with each other. It just be mindful. And then there's also radio silence. Make sure you observe and respect radio silence when it's been requested. So there's also a few good practices that you can keep in mind. On your 24-hour pack person, like if you have your pockets full of all the things you need, or in your backpack, then one of those items is in fact a notepad and pens. So if you are ever making a radio call, I recommend you write down what information you need to write down, like if you have to report in the status of the team, how many people, how they're doing, where you're located, like your coordinates. All of that information, you write that down, and the mission radio operator can transmit that information to mission base. So the ground team leader or the GTL might delegate to the MRO, mission radio operator, that we need to give them our 30-minute status update, and then that's how that would happen. When you are talking on the radio, you want to speak slowly, clearly, and concisely without elongating what you're saying. You want to have some brevity in addition to that very clear enunciated word pronunciation, because if you're slurring your words together, it can be really hard to understand on the radio. And if there's like static in the background or anything like that, that can make it very challenging. And if someone's life is at stake, you don't want the radio to be the issue getting in the way of them getting help. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. And if you're speaking slowly and clearly, then you are less likely to have to repeat yourself than if someone is speaking very, very quickly. Additionally, just make sure your radio volume is turned up to be loud enough in the field so that you can listen to it. I know some people, they just turn down their radio volume because it just feels like it's too loud and it bothers them all the time. The slight inconvenience of having it on at a loud enough of a volume to hear is worth it, because you need to be able to hear when you are being called. Like at encampments, I know I've tried to call other people and they never respond. And I'm like, hey, I've been trying to call you on the radio for 20 minutes and I found you now, but I needed to talk to you a while ago. What happened to your radio? And they'd be like, oh, I forgot to replace the battery and it's dead. And I'm like, ugh. Or they didn't have their volume up. So just make sure your batteries are charged So if it's like the beginning of the day, make sure you got your fresh batteries, and take care of your radio. So I also just want to briefly go into like how the handheld radios work. There's typically like a rotating section, which is the antenna, and you can twist it on, twist it off. Don't play with it, and don't carry the radio by the antenna. The reason why is because that is where you transmit the information, and by ruining the antenna, you ruin it for everyone else, and that's a resource that's gone. You can't use that anymore because it doesn't serve its purpose. You can replace the antenna, but like that's just a waste. So make sure you're not doing that. And when you have the battery pack, you normally have to clip it in correctly, and you like slide it into the slot and click in. So just be mindful. That is typically how it works. So, excuse me. So that is generally all of the information that you will need for ICUT. There might be one or two pieces that I didn't include that are on the actual test, but those are good pieces of information that I hope you can utilize when you are taking your ICUT, if you haven't taken it already, or if you're using this as a review video. I hope that you found it to be useful as well. So that is all, folks, and thank you so much for watching. So I'm a head out. Toodles.